The thing Mara noticed when the transport broke the tree line was that the facility still had its lights on. That shouldn't have been possible. The Varek had been in system for 11 days, and the power grid across the northern continent had been dark for 8 of them. No generators, no backup cells. The Varek didn't leave infrastructure standing, they left examples. But the research station on the ridge, the one that had been abandoned for 6 years before the invasion, and half forgotten before that, was throwing pale amber light into the fog like it was waiting for someone. "You seeing that?" Danny said, from the seat behind her. Mara didn't answer. She was already leaning forward, her breath misting the cracked windshield of the crawler they'd taken from the highway depot outside Falkirk. The 3 of them had been moving for 4 days. Before that, they'd been in the shelter under the college. 98 people, then 70, then 41, then a number she had stopped counting. The Varek had a systematic quality to them that was almost bureaucratic. They cataloged, they extracted, they moved on.
"It's the facility,"
Rhea said from the cargo area, not looking up from the wound she was wrapping on her forearm. "Mara's mum's place." "I know what it is," Mara said. "I'm just saying it out loud so we can all acknowledge that it's a terrible idea." Mara said nothing. She pulled the crawler off the road and onto the old access track, the tires biting into wet soil that hadn't been disturbed in years. Pine branches scraped the roof. The lights ahead held steady, amber and unwavering, the way her mother's desk lamp used to look from the car park on the late nights when Mara came to collect her. A woman who could never leave when the work was interesting, which was always. Her mother had been dead for 3 years before the Varek arrived. The timing, Mara had decided, was merciful. The facility was a squat brutalist block set into the ridge, its concrete face swallowed by 6 years of creeping ivy and moss. The signage was gone. Stripped, she assumed, when the university had formally closed the site. It had been a neurological research station first. Then, briefly, a private psychiatric annex. Then a place that hosted very specific studies that the funding bodies had quietly stopped asking about. The kind of place that accumulated history the way old buildings accumulated damp. Invisibly until the walls were saturated. Psst. She stopped the crawler, 30 meters from the entrance, and killed the engine. "We go in, we check it out, we leave if it's occupied," Danny said. "And if it's the Varek?" Rhea asked. "And we drive very fast in the other direction. The crawler does 40 kilometers an hour. Then we drive very fast and with great optimism." Mara was already out of the vehicle. She stood in the wet air and looked at the building and felt the particular quality of silence that came from a place that had been closed too long. A silence that was not peaceful, but held like breath before a word. She had been here twice as a child, once as a teenager, and many times as an adult, when she'd started doing her mother's work in a different field, and found herself making the drive up to the ridge to look at files that had been filed incorrectly, and were now technically hers to inherit. She knew the smell of it. Damp concrete, old chemicals, the faint sweetness of whatever her mother had used to keep the lab mice calm. She knew the layout from memory. She had never quite understood why. They went in through the east access door, which was unlocked, which should not have been the case. The corridor beyond was dim but functional, overhead strips, throwing that same amber light that suggested either a low-power backup system or something she didn't want to consider yet. The floor was covered in the debris of years. Plaster dust, the husks of dead insects, a single woman's shoe that had no business being there. Their footsteps were careful and quiet. "Someone's been here recently," Danny said, crouching over a section of floor where the dust had been disturbed. Not a single set of tracks, several, crossing and recrossing. "Different sizes. Before the invasion?" Rhea asked. "The depth. These are fresh." Mara had already moved ahead. There was a particular pull to the facility that she found difficult to articulate. A gravitational quality that had nothing to do with nostalgia, and everything to do with the quality of the light and the faint hum she could feel in the walls. A vibration below auditory range that she felt in her back teeth. She had felt it before, years ago, and her mother had told her it was the ventilation system. Her mother had said a lot of things that turned out to be adjacent to the truth, rather than the thing itself. She pushed open the door to the main research corridor and stopped. The corridor was occupied. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs extended in front of him, dressed in a suit that had been expensive once and was now thoroughly ruined, and he was watching the door as if he had been expecting exactly this. He was perhaps 60, with a face that had been lived in hard, and he held a tablet computer in his lap and a mug of something that had gone cold beside him. "Dr. Mara Selden," he said. "You look like your mother." Mara said, "Who are you?" Not a question, a test. "My name is Callum Price. I was the facility's last research director before it was mothballed. I also worked with your mother for 11 years, which I suspect you knew, since you accessed my personnel files approximately 6 times over the past 4 years." He tilted his head. "I didn't mind. I was curious to see if you'd come here." "The lights," Danny said from behind Mara. "Geothermal tap. Your mother's work, as a matter of fact. Off-grid, undetectable, and the Varek have so far shown no interest in the ridge because there's nothing here worth extracting." He paused. "So they believe." Mara stepped into the corridor fully. Her hand was at her side, close to the field knife she'd taken from the depot, and she did not take it away from the knife. "What's here?" Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and pressed his palm flat against the wall beside him, and the wall, which Mara had assumed was concrete, shifted, and behind it was not concrete but darkness, and from the darkness came a sound that she recognized from 6 years of her mother's research notes as the precise tonal signature of a working Varek communications array. "Question," Price said, "is what was here. Past tense. They came and they left something behind. And your mother, God rest her, spent the last 4 years of her life figuring out how to use it against them. She just didn't live to see them arrive." He stood, unhurried, and picked up the cold mug and set it on a ledge and said, "I've been waiting for someone who could finish it. Your mother said, if it ever came to it, that you'd be the one." Mara said nothing for a moment. Outside, somewhere over the ridge to the south, she heard the subsonic pressure wave of a Varek atmospheric skimmer making a pass. The amber light in the corridor held steady, unbothered. "Show me," she said. "Sure." The room behind the false wall had been her mother's real laboratory. Mara understood this immediately and completely in the way that children understand things about their parents that were never spoken aloud. The recognition hitting her, not as surprise, but as the settling of a suspicion she had always carried. The public lab had been real. The neurology, the cognitive mapping work, the peer-reviewed papers. This room, half the size of a shipping container and buried in the ridge's geothermal profile, was where the actual work had happened. The Varek communications array dominated the far wall. It was not beautiful. None of their technology was, in the way that human technology aspired to beauty. It was functional in the way that a wound is functional, efficiently occupying the space it needed to occupy, nothing wasted on anything that did not serve the work. It was roughly hemispherical, perhaps 2 meters across, composed of a material that her mother's notes described as grown rather than manufactured, and it pulsed with a light that was not quite bioluminescent and not quite electronic but something in between that had no name in any language Mara knew. Around it, her mother had built 6 years of annotations. Paper, mostly. Her mother had distrusted digital storage for anything she considered important. The walls were covered, equations, diagrams, printouts annotated in 3 colors of pen, photographs with arrows and circled regions. In one corner, a pair of her mother's reading glasses sat on top of a stack of notebooks. Mara looked at them for a moment and then looked away. "She called it the bell," Price said. "Their word for it is something we can't pronounce. But the function is the same. It's a resonance transmitter. The Varek don't use radio, don't use conventional electromagnetic communication. They use a type of phase-modulated wave that propagates through dense matter, rock, atmosphere, the hull of a ship, without significant attenuation." He moved to stand beside the array, "Which is why our jamming never worked. We were blocking the wrong frequencies. We're blocking the window, and they were coming through the walls." "What did she find?" Mara said. that it works both ways. He turned to face her. The bell transmits, but it also receives. And a sufficiently precise reciprocal signal, one that matches the phase geometry of the Varek network architecture, doesn't just communicate, it disrupts. Ria had moved past Mara and was standing close to the array, her head tilted, listening to the things she couldn't hear, but could apparently feel the same way Mara felt it in her back teeth. Disrupts how? Their fleet coordination, their targeting systems, their ability to communicate across a battle group. Price pulled up the tablet. The Varek don't operate as individual units. They're a networked organism, essentially. Every vessel, every ground unit, every extraction team is in continuous phase contact with every other. It's what makes them so effective. It's also what makes them vulnerable to a sufficiently precise phase inversion broadcast. He set the tablet down. Your mother's last notebook has the calculations. The signal geometry. Everything needed to take the bell from passive receiver to active transmitter with the right frequency profile. She finished it, Mara said. It was not a question either. She finished it. She got sick before she could test it. By the time I understood what she'd built, she was gone, and the facility was closed, and I was the only person who knew this room existed. He paused. I have been sitting here for 11 days hoping someone useful would walk through the door. Danny had been quiet this whole time, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching. She said, and if it works, what's the range? Hemisphere-wide, potentially. The geothermal tap gives it enough power. Price pulled that last notebook from the shelf where it had been sitting, spine out, beside the others, and held it out to Mara. She wrote your name on the inside cover. Mara took it. She did not open it immediately. She stood holding it, feeling the weight of it, which was less than she expected, and more than she could account for. Her mother had been a precise woman, a careful woman, a woman who did not do sentimental things without reason. The name on the inside cover was not sentiment. It was a set of instructions that had been written years before they were needed. She had spent a long time being angry at her mother. For the secrecy. For the long nights in the facility when Mara had eaten dinner alone. For the work that had consumed everything else, and that Mara had never been allowed to understand. She had spent some time being grateful for the same things after, and she had spent the time since, the invasion being neither angry nor grateful, but something more functional than either. A quality of attention that was her mother's exact quality of attention, recognizable because she'd watched it for 22 years and absorbed it without meaning to. She opened the notebook. The handwriting was familiar in the way that the smell of the facility was familiar. Precise, slightly compressed, the letters made with a technical pen and not a ballpoint. The way her mother had always insisted on writing, even when everyone else had moved to tablets. Mara read. Then she read again. Then she set the notebook on the workbench and picked up the reading glasses from the stack in the corner. Because the light in the room was amber, and her mother's handwriting was small, and she had her mother's eyes, which meant she had her mother's difficulty reading small text in amber light. And she settled the glasses onto her nose and read a third time. Outside, the atmospheric skimmer made another pass. Closer this time. They're triangulating, Ria said quietly. Not us, Price said. The geothermal signature. They've been trying to figure out the ridge for days. The output profile is too steady for a natural system. How long do we have? Danny asked. Or they find the access road, hours before they breach the facility? Less. Mara closed the notebook. She looked at the array. The bell, her mother had called it, and she thought about what it meant to finish someone else's work. Not to improve it, not to build on it, but to carry it the last distance to the point where it could be used. Her mother had done the hard part. Mother had understood the Varek at a level that the military had not reached in 11 days of open warfare. Not as enemies to be defeated conventionally, but as a system to be interrupted. Interrupt the system. Everything else follows, she said. I need 2 hours. Price looked at her carefully. Do you understand the notebook? My mother wrote it for me, so yes. She met his eyes. I need 2 hours, and I need everyone out of this room except me, because I'm going to be running calculations on the signal geometry, and I can't do that. And also talk to people. Danny started to object. Mara looked at her. 2 hours, Mara said again. Then we go home. They left her. Even Price, who seemed to understand something about the room, that she was still understanding herself, that it required a specific kind of solitude, the kind her mother had always insisted on, the kind that was not loneliness but focus made physical. She sat at the workbench. She opened the notebook. She began. Mother's calculations were elegant in the way that a bridge is elegant. Not decorative, but load-bearing. Every element doing exactly what it needed to do, and nothing extra. The signal geometry was built on the principle that the Varek network communicated in phase-coherent bundles, each one a harmonic variation on a master frequency that was constant across the fleet. The breakthrough. And Mara recognized it as a breakthrough the way you recognize a key fitting a lock. The small, definitive click of rightness was that the master frequency was not broadcast. True. It was resonant. It was the frequency at which the bell itself vibrated, continuously, as a function of its own material composition. Her mother had spent 4 years listening to the bell, learning its resonant signature, building a reciprocal, a signal that matched the network architecture well enough to propagate through it, but carried, in its phase geometry, an inversion that would propagate outward through every connected node. Not a weapon. An interruption. A precisely shaped silence dropped into a system that had never experienced silence. Mara worked. She checked the calculations. She found 3 small errors and corrected them. And she felt a strange and specific grief doing it. The grief of correcting someone who could no longer correct themselves, who had left the work just shy of finished, because the body had given out before the mind was done. She corrected the errors the way her mother would have corrected them, with the technical pen that was still clipped to the notebook's spine, making marks in the margin, in the same compressed handwriting that she had apparently inherited, without being taught. At some point Danny brought her tea. She did not look up. The mug sat cooling beside her elbow. She drank it eventually without tasting it, the way her mother had always drunk the tea that Mara brought her on the late nights. Subsonic pressure wave of the skimmer came again, and this time there was a second signature behind it. Heavier, lower, the bone frequency of a ground extraction unit. Tricked. They were close to the access road now, turned to the array's interface, which was human-built. Her mother had constructed the control substrate out of salvaged university equipment, wired to the bell through an intermediary system that translated human-readable inputs into phase-modulated commands. It was inelegant visually. Cables held with cable ties, heat-shrink tubing over junctions, handwritten labels on every connection. But it worked. She could see the power draw cycling through the geothermal tap, the indicator lights her mother had installed along the top of the bell, housing glowing, amber, and steady. She connected the calculation outputs to the broadcast parameters. She ran the initialization sequence. The bell changed. It was not a visible change, and it was not precisely a sound. It was more like the moment when the pressure in a room shifts before a storm. A quality of the air, a new weight behind the silence. The amber indicators climbed. The resonant hum she felt in her back teeth shifted pitch by some fractional interval that she couldn't have named, but knew was correct, the way she knew the corrected calculations were correct. She went to the door and opened it. Price was in the corridor, sitting on the floor again, back against the wall. He looked up at her. "Is it running?" he asked. "It's initializing. 2 minutes to full amplitude." She looked down the corridor toward the east access door. "Where are the others?" "Watching the ridge. The extraction unit is on the track. They'll be at the access door in 8-9 minutes. Mara nodded. She looked at the facility around her, the amber light, the plaster dust, the single shoe on the floor that she had decided meant nothing. She thought about her mother working here for 4 years. In the building she'd supposedly vacated. Coming back through the east access door in the dark. Working alone in the real lab behind the false wall. Drinking cold tea, she thought. I understand it now, not the work. She had always been able to understand the work given enough time. She understood why her mother had come back, night after night, to a building that was supposed to be empty. Not for the research. Not for the Varek. Since the Varek hadn't arrived yet, and her mother hadn't known they were coming. Not with certainty, anyway. Her mother had come back because the work was interesting. And when the work was interesting, she could not leave it. And that quality in her, that inability to leave interesting work unfinished, was the thing Mara had spent years resenting and was standing in right now on wearing her mother's readings list at hats, having just spent 2 hours finishing her mother's calculations. The apple, she thought. The tree. The indicators reached full amplitude. The bell broadcast. She felt it, not in her back teeth this time, but in her sternum, in the architecture of her ribs. A vibration that passed through her and kept going. Through the concrete, through the rock, through the ridge, through the air above the ridge, through the atmosphere where the Varek skimmer was banking to make another pass over the access road. The frequency was exactly what her mother had calculated. The phase geometry was exact. The inversion was perfect. 2 seconds passed. 3. The bone frequency of the extraction unit below the ridge stopped. Skimmer's subsonic signature. She had been tracking it the way you track a sound that's bothering you. Below conscious awareness. Stopped. The silence that followed was not the held silence of the facility. It was a different silence. The silence of systems that had been continuously operating for 11 days and were now not operating. The silence of a network that had just encountered something it had never encountered. Itself, inverted, dropped into every node at once. Ma stood in the corridor and listened to it. Then Danny shouting from somewhere near the entrance. And then Rhea, and the shouting was not alarmed. It was the particular quality of shouting that you means let yourself believe was possible, that you had decided was probably impossible in the interest of not being destroyed by hope. And it is happening anyway. She walked to the east access door and pushed it open. The extraction unit was on the track below the ridge, 3 vehicles in a column, and all 3 had stopped. Not stop the way vehicles stop when they're waiting. Stop the way machines stop when the instructions running them have been interrupted and not resumed. The Varek soldiers, 7 of them visible, or possibly more in the vehicles, were standing very still. They were not defending, not advancing. They stood with the slightly unfocused quality of individuals who had just lost something they had never been without. Their network was down. They had never, in the history of their species' military operations, operated without their network. They did not know how to. Danny was standing 6 meters away with her rifle up, and her hands shaking, and her eyes very bright. Mara said, "Don't. They're not a threat right now." Mara, "They're not a threat. Look at them." She looked at the Varek on the track. They were physically imposing. She had seen enough footage to know that much. Taller than a human by a significant margin, the body plan vaguely bilateral, but the bilateral symmetry offset in ways that were deeply uncomfortable to look at for more than a few seconds. Their equipment was sophisticated and clearly still functional. The problem was not the equipment. The problem was that the equipment was designed for operators who were continuously networked to a and control architecture that was currently not there. And the operators did not know how to make decisions without it. 7 Varek soldiers, on a ridge in Scotland, in the fog, trying to remember how to be individuals. Broadcast will propagate outward, Price said from behind her. He had come through the door quietly. Bell is designed to self-sustain once amplitude is reached. It'll keep broadcasting until we turn it off. He paused. Or until they destroy the facility. They won't, Mara said. Look at them. She started down the track. Danny said, with remarkable restraint, "What are you doing?" "My mother spent 4 years building something to talk to them," Mara said, not stopping. "Not to them, to talk." She kept walking. "The inversion isn't a weapon. It's an introduction. It's saying, we know what you are. We know how you work. And we can interrupt it, which means we can also restore it, which means we have something you need." She was 20 meters away now. The nearest Varek, the one that seemed most senior, based on some quality of its equipment, or bearing that she was reading entirely on instinct, turned to look at her. Its visual apparatus was different from human eyes, set laterally, capable of a range of perception she couldn't fully grasp. But she could read attention in the way it oriented toward her, because attention was attention. She stopped walking. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her mother's technical pen. She held it up. Not as a weapon, obviously not as a weapon. As a thing that meant, I'm someone who works with a pen. I'm someone who calculates. I'm someone who built this thing you're currently experiencing. And I built it not to destroy you but to make you understand that we could. And that we are choosing not to. The Varek senior unit looked at the pen for a long moment. Then it did something with its bilateral body that Mara couldn't parse as a gesture, but which Price, from behind her, translated as best he could. That's, he started. Your mother documented it. That's acknowledgement. Mara lowered the pen. Acknowledgement of what? That you're someone worth talking to. She stood in the fog on the ridge in front of 7 Varek soldiers, whose network she had interrupted and whose commanding unit had just indicated that she was a person of interest rather than an extraction target. And she thought about her mother sitting alone in that room for 4 years, building something that was not a gun, and she thought, there it is. That was the work. Not the equations, not the bell. Patient, stubborn, careful refusal to decide that the only answer was destruction. The insistence that if you understood something well enough, you could find the frequency that it listened to. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's handwriting, and apparently, standing here, her mother's particular quality of stillness, the stillness that was not fear but focus, the kind that made it clear you were someone who had calculated the situation and was prepared to stand in it until it resolved. The fog moved on the ridge. Below in the valley, the distant sounds of combat had stopped. She couldn't know if it was hemisphere-wide yet. Price would need to monitor, but the silence from the valley suggested it was spreading, the inversion propagating outward through the network the way a crack propagates through glass. Following the geometry of the thing it was moving through, inevitable once started. The Varek senior unit moved. It was not an attack. It was a reorientation, turning toward the facility, then back to her, then to the facility again. Price, quietly. It wants to see where the signal came from. Mara looked at the building over her shoulder. Mother's building, lit amber, in the fog. The one that had always had its lights on when she came to collect her. Shh. All right, she said. She walked back up the track to the east access door and pushed it open and held it, the way she had learned to hold doors as a child, because her mother always had her hands full. The Varek senior unit followed her inside. In the corridor, under the amber light, with the plaster dust and the single shoe and the hum of the bell still running behind the false wall, Mara led it to the real laboratory, and let it see the bell, and let it see the workbench and the notebook, and the walls covered in her mother's handwriting. She let it look for a long time. She did not know what it was seeing. She did not know how it processed evidence. What constituted proof of capability versus intent? Whether the concept of legacy was something its networked consciousness could translate into individual understanding. She knew only what she had done. Stood in her mother's work, finished her mother's calculations, held her mother's pen, up to something vast and frightening in a fog, and waited. The Varek senior unit turned to her. It made the gesture again, the one Price had called acknowledgement. This time he didn't translate. He didn't need to. She was someone worth talking to. Outside, somewhere over the southern ridge, the last skimmer went quiet. The fog absorbed the silence, the way fog absorbs everything, patiently, without judgment, converting it into something that was simply part of the air. Mara stood in her mother's laboratory, in her mother's glasses, with her mother's pen clipped back to the notebook spine, and waited for the conversation to begin. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of interesting work you couldn't leave.